that there still remains a common misconception that CBD bought from the high street retailers and online is the same as the products which you can only get via private prescription.
Hi, everyone, and welcome back to Harmonia Podcast. We are joined here today by Ezra, who is a substance misuse consultant and is going to explore how cannabis is. No, do you know what? I'm not going to go into it. I'm actually going to hand over to Ezra. Ezra, hi, how are you?
I'm good, thank you. How are you doing,
I'm all
Ezra?
right. Thank you so much for joining us today. Do you want to
That's okay.
give a bit of an introduction for yourself?
Yes, so should I share my slides, which I'm going to
Yeah,
be
perfect. Thank you so much.
presenting? Bear with me one sec. Can you see that?
Yes, I can see the slide.
Excellent. So today I'm going to be talking a bit around substance misuse in particular, cannabis, and also looking at a bit around psychological dependency and also the about bit about medical cannabis and the difference between the two. So just to touch a bit about myself, so I am the director of Edifying Answers, which is a training consultancy. My background is around substance misuse. I've worked in this field since 2005. I've worked in the prisons, supporting people around one to ones, group based interventions, and then I manage services around psychosocial interventions and supporting people around their recovery and their well-being. I'm also a qualified mediator with the Civil Mediation Council. I'm also an approved DISC facilitator. I'm a motivational speaker, so I do different talks in venues and for organizations. And I'm a well-being lead, so I specialize on different areas around well-being and supporting people around their kind of holistic health. And various things as a coach, group facilitator, and also trustee for National Voices.
Thank
So that's a bit about me in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Ezra. That's like such an incredible resume there. And thank you so much for joining us here. And I will hand the floor back over to you.
Thank you. So, in terms of what we're going to be covering today is these three main areas. So, looking about exploring cannabis, what it is, how it works, looking a bit around medical cannabis, its purpose, its benefits, and what the research shows in terms of some of the challenges it presents. And then finally, finishing up on psychological dependency, the risks and how it can develop when people are using cannabis to self medicate. So, just to touch on some foundational bits around cannabis. So, it is a class B substance and it is a depressant, which means that it slows down the central nervous system, which consists of the brain and the spinal cord. And as a result of that, all parts of our systems are slowed down. The different methods in which it can be used, you can eat it, you can drink it in teas and stuff like that, you can smoke it, and you can vape it. And it has a whole range of different names. I've just chosen a few there that you can see on the screen. So I just wanted to touch on some of the effects around cannabis, some of the common effects. So the first one is that when people are smoking it, some people can feel faint or even feel sick, which is sometimes referred to as a whitey. Because of the hippocampus, there is lots of THC receptors, which is delta tetrahydrocannabinol receptors, that changes the way that we process information. And so, users, it can affect their memory and their judgment. It becomes impaired when people are using cannabis. The cannabis smoke is made up of a variety of toxic chemicals, including ammonia and hydrogen cyanide, which can irritate the chest passage and also the lungs. And then cannabis can damage the structure of your sperm cells, deforming them. So even small amounts of cannabis has been proven in cases to cause temporary, infertility in some men, not all men, in some men. And changes can also occur in the cerebellum, which controls our kind of balance and our coordination, and the basal ganglia, which is why movement can sometimes be impaired and balance can be a bit off when people are smoking cannabis, which is why they say, as well as don't drink drive, they say don't drug drive as well. And then the final thing is that users may experience cotton mouth, which is basically due to a lack of saliva production, that the mouth can feel really dry. Okay, so these are just some of those kind of basic fundamental um, side effects that can occur with cannabis. We're going to get onto some of the more serious ones in a bit. So when we're thinking about the impact that cannabis can have on the user, we're thinking about THC in particular, which, depending on how the plant has been grown and the amount of UV light has been put on it, it can really make the THC levels very high. But what we know, so if we're looking at this chart here, on the left hand side, we have the different parts of the brain structure. In the middle section, it has the areas that that particular brain structure regulates. And then on the right hand side, we have how the THC can affect the user. And so if we think of something like the amygdala is what is known as it's a part of the limbic system that helps us in particularly with things like fear and alarm when we're in threat or we're in danger. And so it's referred to as the fire alarm system. And so it triggers off whenever we're in danger or when we're alarmed by something in normal circumstances. But depending on how high the THC levels are within the cannabis, it can actually trigger that alarm off. So, like a faulty alarm system, which creates more panic and more paranoia within the individual. And my definition when I say paranoia is when the brain is unable to decipher reality, makes an assumption, and exaggerates it. And so, people, when they are smoking cannabis, can be putting themselves in particular dilemmas because of how the THC is affecting different parts of the brain structure. So there are some particular interesting trends in terms of cannabis use. And this information comes from the ONS, which is the national statistics, the what's the whole stuff?
Do you know?
What is
You
the
know
O
what?
for
I
again?
forgot as well. ONS. Oh, for the
It's something national
yeah, yeah, it's
statistics.
grand.
Office of National Statistics. Okay. So there's some very interesting trends around cannabis use, and these particular statistics comes from the Office of National Statistics, which was in June of 2022. And so the first one is that since estimates began in the year ending December 1995, cannabis has consistently been the most used drug in England and Wales in terms of illicit substances. In the last year, 7.4% and 16.2% of adults aged 16 to 59 and 16 to 24-year-olds, respectively, reported having used the drug in the last year. So we can see that there's big amounts and numbers of people who are using this substance. And over one third of adults, which is 38.7%, aged between 16 and 59 years old have used cannabis in the last year and used it more than once a month, with 11.5 using it every day. And this is quite interesting because when we start to look a bit later on in this, you will see in terms of the numbers of people who have medical conditions who are using cannabis. So there's a link between the two where people are self medicating. And then broken down by drug type, those who are earning less than £10,400 per year were most likely to be using cannabis. That was 13.2%. So when we're talking about cannabis and mental health, there is some links there that's really important that we are also aware of. So cannabis releases over 400 chemicals in the brain, 60 of those which fit into the category of cannabinoids, which are unique to the cannabis plant. So according to the National Institute for Drug Abuse, they have said that large enough doses of cannabis or high concentrations of THC have been the cause of hallucinations and delusions in people who are using cannabis. And they also showed that actually there is some link to the amount of cannabis use that someone is using and developing mental health disorders like depression and anxiety. And in terms of schizophrenia, with regular use is often correlated with an increased risk of developing a psychotic illness such as schizophrenia. And there are factors that contribute to that as well, depending on the time when someone starts using. So if people are using cannabis during their teens before the brain is fully developed, that can also impact on it. But also if there is a family history of mental illness. But cannabis has also been shown to increase the risk of a relapse if someone does actually suffer with schizophrenia. So, NIH, the National Institute of Health, they did some research into looking at cannabis use and its association with psychological disorders. This was done in 2020. And they found some really interesting results as a result of this study. So they said recent societal changes have increased the use of both medical and recreational cannabis. So when they're talking about recent events, talking about the pandemic, people being socially isolated, Brexit, all of these different significant factors that have come into play. And that patients with mental illnesses are considered more vulnerable and are more prone to reward seeking behavior. I'm going to come back to this in a few slides, right? Because that's really important. But what this is saying is that they're more vulnerable because of their mental health, but also they're more prone to seek reward, to seek out something that's going to alleviate their pain and make them feel better. Cannabis use disorder, CUD, has been shown to have an increased prevalence in individuals with mental illness, creating an explosive cocktail. So, what they were basically saying is that people who have been using cannabis have been shown to have an increase in mental health issues, which then makes them want to use more to feel better about their mental health, but then creates a cycle of that continuous process. And approximately 1 in 4 patients with schizophrenia are also diagnosed with CUD. And cannabis use is also associated with 2 to 4 times the likelihood of developing a psychosis in healthy individuals. So, this is really important for people to be aware of this, that even people who are in a healthy state, you're 2 to 4 times more likely to develop a psychosis based on how much cannabis they are smoking. Then the other area which is really important to think about is just in terms of how tar builds up within the lungs, right? So when cannabis produces about 50% more tar than cigarettes by themselves, okay? And obviously, when people are smoking cannabis, we have to remember they do not have the filter that cigarettes have. Cigarettes have a massive filter for a reason because there's over 4,000 different chemicals, 70 of which are cancerous, that people are smoking and inhaling. So imagine all of that's coming in without the filter and it's 50% more tar than cigarettes by themselves. The other thing that's really important to be aware of is in terms of people holding in the smoke for long periods of time, thinking that it's actually going to make them get higher. And it doesn't. That's a myth. It actually only allows more toxins into the body without increasing the number of THC levels. And smoking 5 joints a day for just 6 to 8 weeks can result in a deterioration of lung functioning. And the longer this goes on for, is the more damage that it causes. So, just a quick note in terms of methods, effects, and duration. So, it's really important that people are aware of this because, in particularly with the case with when eating it, so like in a weed cake or cannabis cake, what people often don't realize, especially if it's their first time doing it, is that it takes about 2 hours for the effect to kick in, and it lasts for up to 8 hours. And this is really important because I've had clients who I've worked with in the past where they've, before they knew this, and they took some cake and they said, "Ah, this ain't doing nothing." Then they took some more, waited another half an hour, then they took some more. And then when it eventually kicked in, obviously it was really bad for them and it was lasting for 8 hours. Yeah. So it's just really important to be aware of that if that is something that you plan to do in the future. Just a quick note on the difference between smoking and vaporizing. So, vaporizing is a much healthier way if you are going to be smoking cannabis. And the reason for that is because combustion is what creates the smoke, which is the main cause of lung cancer and many other respiratory disorders. And so when you're smoking it in a joint, as you can see at the bottom there, it raised the heat level is like 2012 degrees. The cannabis plant begins to combust at 392 degrees. But when vaporizing, you can see the sweet spot in terms of where it's the most beneficial for you is only at 338 degrees. And so it's much more healthier for you to vaporize than it is to smoke. So you're getting, it removes 95% of the smoke and it's less harmful and you have a better experience. This is just another visual aid to just highlight what I was saying before in terms of the myth and its pointless in terms of holding your breath. All you are doing is allowing more tar and dangerous chemicals to be absorbed. How THC works is that actually 95% of the cannabis is absorbed within the first few seconds. So the tip is take small, shallow puffs rather than these long, deep ones that actually is not doing anything for you other than harming you. So, just a quick touch on the endocannabinoid system. I won't go into it in too much detail, but some of the key things is to remember is that so THC and CBN are the two kind of keys that open the doors to. So, this the THC opens the door to the kind of central nervous system, which will be the CB1, and the CBN, the cannabinol, opens the immune system signals. So if you see the individual there, as you can see, the lighter blue is the areas where the THC would affect, and the darker blue is the areas where the immune system is being affected when someone takes cannabis. But the CBD, although it doesn't directly link into any of those areas, it does have significant impacts, which you'll see in this next slide. So I'm just going to touch on the CBD for a bit, and you can see within all of these the different areas that they affect. But CBD in particular, it helps to control certain cancers. It eases pain. It can stimulate bone growth. It stops the growth of bacteria. So there's so many different. It slows inflammation. So there's so many key benefits of the CBD, which is also in the cannabis plant, but it's also when prescribed medically, it's in there as well, which makes it beneficial for individuals who are suffering due to their medical condition, which we'll look at in a bit. This is just a quick note to remind people that when we are thinking about the different cannabinoids and what impacts people when they take cannabis, there is the non-psychoactive areas of it and there is the psychoactive areas of it. And so you can see like with the CBD, which is non-psychoactive, and you have the THC, which is psychoactive. And this is why when people are taking cannabis illicitly, which has high levels of THC, why it can have such an impact on them. Whereas when you are taking the medical one, although it may have little bits of THC, it's not in high enough amounts to actually make you high or cause you any harm. So let's look briefly at medical cannabis. So the purpose of medical cannabis is reserved for those with significant health conditions who haven't responded well to first line therapies, right? So they need additional support and help to help them to manage their pain or their condition. And it can only be prescribed by doctors for people who have particular health conditions, as you can see some of them listed down on the page there. Now, interestingly, many people are still unaware of this, but medical cannabis was made legal since November 2018. And I think this is a real area where we need to raise more awareness and people need to understand so that they can see there is legitimate ways and means in which they can get the support that they need. But as we'll see as we go on a bit later, there is some reasons where also it's not just about not being aware of that, there's other complications which results in why people still self-medicate with cannabis. So this was a study which was done by, or research by Cannabis Health, and they did some surveys to find out what's going on with people, where is their level of awareness, why is things happening the way they are in terms of people not accessing medical cannabis. And they said that even though people were aware, some people were aware, yet still half, 52% of the population were unaware of the facts that cannabis had been made legal since 2018. And over a third, 38%, said that they'll still be nervous in trying it, even though they could use that legitimate means. There was a study, a poll that was done by YouGov in 2022, and they suggested that approximately 1.8 million people with diagnosed medical conditions are turning to illegally obtain cannabis to manage their illness. And that this was actually an increase of 400,000 since 2019. So even though people knew, some maybe didn't, but there is a huge increase of people who could benefit from medical cannabis that are still smoking illicit substances, cannabis in this case, to manage their health and medical conditions. So I wanted to find out what is going on here. Why is this happening? So I found this interesting survey data, which was published by the PLEA, the Patient-Led Engagement for Access. And this was done in 2022. And they found that over 60% of legal patients have experienced unreasonable delays to their prescription, and 31% saying that they have had issues with quality control. So, two significant things that can impact on them in terms of the service, what they're getting. On top of this, over a third of patients are saying that they pay more than £350 a month for their medication. And many are using their benefits to do so. So this is a significant barrier for those individuals because that's a lot of money to spend per month. And when asked by Cannabis Health why they prefer to access their medicine through the illicit market, patients cited concerns over quality and delivery, exposed products. So the products, when it was being delivered, they was maybe showing what it was and they didn't want people to know. A lack of choice, data protection violations, which is a huge issue, and high costs as the key reasons as to why they will go into illicit substances rather than medical cannabis. So there's work to be done still. The other thing that came out from this, and this was from a survey that was done in 2023, that there still remains a common misconception that CBD bought from the high street retailers and online is the same as the products which you can only get via private prescription. And so there's a misconception that people think it's all the same thing and they can just go to Holland and Barrett and buy some CBD products and it will work for them. And the truth of the matter is, it won't, because the over the counter CBD products, they're not pharmaceutical grade products, meaning that they haven't been evidence tested to show their effectiveness for people who have medical conditions, to show that it will meet the need and support them to manage their pain. Also, it's important to be aware that these products that are bought over the counter, that they can affect metabolism of certain medications. So it's really important that if you are thinking about it and you want to get them from over the counter, that you check with your GP and make sure if you are on any medication to see that it doesn't affect it in any way, shape, or form. The other thing which is important to be aware of, as I said earlier, is that with medical cannabis, that there may be some THC in it when it's deemed to be in the best interest of the patient, but it will be in low levels. The same is true in terms of with CBD oils that can be bought over the counter. In the UK anyway, they will never be over zero point 0.2 levels of THC. So you wouldn't get high on those products either. So just to finish off, I want to touch briefly on the psychological dependency, because I think this is something that's really important. And for some people, they think you can't get a dependency to cannabis, which is wrong. You can do. Doesn't mean you definitely will, but as you'll see with the information I'm going to provide, there is strong chances that it can happen. So when we're talking about psychological dependency, it's a term that describes the emotional or mental component of substance use disorder, such as a strong craving for the substance or behavior and difficulty thinking about anything else. And so it kind of takes a precedence in your thinking, in behaviors, in actions, a desire and a craving and a want for that to fulfill a need psychologically for the individual. So, what are the symptoms? Okay, because there's various different symptoms that are involved with psychological dependency, but I'm going to talk about some of the more familiar ones here. So, the first one is a belief that you need the substance to do certain things, whether that's sleeping, socializing, or just generally functioning. So if you are someone listening to this and and these resonate with you, there is a chance you have a psychological dependency. So if you need it to manage, if you need it to cope, if you need it to help you to sleep properly or sleep better, if you need it to socialize and to do your day-to-day activities, that is one of the symptoms of psychological dependency. Having strong emotional cravings for the substance. And so if you don't have it, how are you impacted? If you don't have it when you desire it, what happens to you psychologically and emotionally? Then there's also a loss of interest in your usual activities. So a lot of the time for people, the becomes the main priority and it's prioritized over everything else, over the other things that you need to do or want to do. And then it's also about spending a lot of time using or thinking about the substance. And so these are kind of four of the key symptoms that align with that psychological dependency. Now, I just want to touch a bit about the brain so that we can understand how the brain works and why psychological dependency can develop. So the brain weighs 2% of our body weight, but it takes up 20% of our energy, right? So when we think, the thoughts create enough electricity to light a 15 to 25 watt amp, right? So thoughts cost energy. So as a natural way to preserve energy, we develop shortcuts, which is why you see that picture in the middle there. We develop shortcuts because shortcuts take up less energy. This is why we develop habits. Habits are well-traveled pathways that we don't need to think about, so it don't cost any energy for us to do it. Okay? Our brain makes important behaviors cost less energy, but it determines the importance by how frequently we do things. Now, if you think about this in terms of if someone is, in this case, using cannabis regularly 3 or 4 times a day, the brain is recognizing this frequent activity as something that is important. So, what the brain will do is it will bring that to the person's attention to say, well, last time when you felt this way, you took cannabis. Take cannabis. It's reminding you because you are teaching it by our behaviors to make that become a familiar way of doing things. And repetition is key. Whatever whatever we constantly do is who we are. And so it's really important to be aware of that constant repetition of using that cannabis every day, 5 times a day, 10 times a day, actually makes your brain become conditioned to want to do that more. It's become habitual. You're no longer even thinking about it. There is another factor at play here. So studies show that our subconscious mind gets ready for action zero point 0.2 seconds before we consciously decide to act. So the subconscious mind is active 95% of the time. We are only 5% of the time using our conscious awareness. And this is because if we had to consciously think about everything, the brain would explode. There is so many different things that our subconscious mind is in control of. So we don't have to think to breathe. We don't have to regulate our heart rate. We don't have to do all these things because our subconscious mind is doing those. And so it's only 5% of the time that we're using our conscious awareness. But even when we do use it, zero point 0.2 seconds before we think about it, our subconscious algorithm kicks in. So, bearing in mind, the brain is making shortcuts, it's remembering what you repeatedly do. So, when a situation comes up that triggers you a certain way, the brain, because of that psychological dependency and how you've trained it, is going to remind you to take cannabis to help you cope, to help you feel better, to take away the pain. And all of these work together to create a psychological dependency. There is also this factor, okay, what's called default modes. So, as human beings in general, we are more geared towards pleasure and try to avoid pain. That's a general thing that people tend to do. There is some people who are very disciplined who won't do that, but for the most of us, at least to some degree, we tend to operate out of this unless there is a strong why behind why we're doing what we're doing. And so when we think about this, when someone is using cannabis, it also plays on this because the THC, which is within the cannabis when people are smoking it, it gets them high. They feel good. They get pleasure from it. It also eases pain and it also relaxes them. So it's increasing the pleasure that makes people want to do that because we're geared towards pleasure. But on the flip side of that, we also have the CBD, which eases things like nausea. It slows down inflammation and it controls seizures and epilepsy fits, which is why, again, someone would think this helps to reduce the pain. So, these two factors, even on a subconscious level, which our unconscious, subconscious mind is aware of, would also reinforce the benefits of people smoking cannabis. And the fundamental purpose and its most basic definition of the brain is to keep us safe and ensure our survival. And when someone is taking cannabis to reduce pain and it's helping them to feel better, the brain will sell it as the best thing since sliced bread. And this also can contribute to that psychological dependency. So we know from neuroscience that neurons that fire together wire together. And the more you do something is the more your brain responds to support that activity. And so the more that someone is using that particular activity, in this case, smoking cannabis, you are reinforcing and deepening those neural pathways to say, this is the way that you should do this. This is the way that you should cope. So, final thing I'm going to leave you with this about neuroplasticity and how the brain changes. So we've got these four different areas. We've got neurogenesis, which is the continuous generation of new neurons in certain brain regions, right? And there's different ways that that can happen, which we'll talk about in a sec. Then we have new synapses. So new skills and experiences create new neural connections, right? So it's developing and adapting and building. Then we can strengthen those synapses by repetition, practice, and that continuous working of doing things which strengthens it, which makes that become a well-traveled pathway. And then when we stop doing a certain behavior, we weaken those synapses. This is why we can change behaviors. This is why we can learn new habits. So the less that you do something is the weaker that connection becomes. Now, this is where it gets interesting with neural plasticity, because there are various different ways that it can come from. It can come from meditation, it can come from social interaction, it can come from stress, from traumatic events, from emotions, from paying attention, your diet, exercise, all of these different areas can develop neuroplasticity. But the interesting thing is that it doesn't have any moral compass, meaning whether you're doing the right things or the wrong things, it doesn't matter. The brain will just adapt, respond, and develop according to how you train it. And so it's really important to be aware when we're talking about psychological dependency that the more that you are engaging in these behaviors and you're taking this substance, it is doing something to you. It is changing your brain and it is triggering you to want to do that more and more. And as you can see there, it says neuroplasticity may entrench depressive, anxious, obsessive, and overreactive patterns because whatever you train your brain to do, it will repeat. And so I'll leave it there. That's where I wanted to share in terms of psychological dependency and cannabis.
So, first of all, wow, that was an amazing presentation. I think we definitely will learn a lot from that. My ADHD brain is going because I have so many comments. I've got so many comments, but I'm not going to because I know we've already gone over time. So I just wanted to I think flag maybe two or three things. So with medical cannabis, we do have higher concentrations of THC, and depending on your physical health, you might need a higher concentration. The difference is you don't necessarily get a head high, the same as you would with the illicit market sort of cannabis. And I think just again touching on let's talk change, touching on change, right? So I think it's a really, really crucial
Mm,
thing that you mentioned there, because like all medication, people are prone to psychological dependencies as they would be with medical cannabis. If anything, I think when it comes to medical cannabis in particular, because people have found the medication so effective, it's now put us in a position where sometimes we're like, do I need the medication now, or am I just like, is my body
mm,
just like? Because sometimes I'll have like tiny little ooh, and I'm like, ooh, that's really sore, and I'd reach for my medication. I stop myself and think, I could just stretch, or I can put a heat patch on, or I can do something else. It's not to the level that I need my medication on, but because the medication, and I say this all the time, it's too effective, guys. Yeah, we need to do
mm,
other stuff around it as well because it is quite effective, and so it's your first go-to. And I realized, I think about 2 years ago, that how it how effective it was, and that I needed to make sure that I make lifestyle changes as well. And I think the dangers where people are using in the market, and one of the reasons why the, I guess, medical cannabis community is constantly advocating for those people to legitimize their prescriptions, is that there is no oversight in terms of
Mm,
psychological well-being or physical health, because some people do self-medicate for pain. There is no oversight, which means you're just using the medication, and the medication is a symptom reliever. So you're relieving your symptoms, but you're not actually managing the actual condition that you have. And so I am
yeah.
constantly screaming that you need to also manage your condition. The medication is brilliant, but should not be your be all and end all when it comes to your treatment. And it is important for us to also recognize that we can unfortunately become psychologically dependent, which is why we need to put this in the forefront of our minds and start thinking the next time you pick up your vape, actually, do I need this now? Or can I meditate instead? Or can
Yeah.
I do some yoga instead? Or, I think it's just so important that the medicine side of it is not lost. When I say medicine, medicine means treatment, which means some kind
Mm,
of other intervention other than just the medication. And I was sure about that. But
mm,
Ezra, thank you so much for joining us today. That was absolutely amazing. Like I said, I've got so many comments, but we don't even have time to touch on anything. But it's just, yeah, no, but it's good because it leaves people with stuff to think about. I will admit, I was a little bit
mm,
heartbroken to hear the cannabis health review, where a lot of patients have actually stopped using medical cannabis and would rather get it from the street, even though there's so many risks involved
mm,
there as well. Like, let's not forget 5 to 7 year prison sentence. It's a Class B drug, and people
yeah.
would rather take that risk
Yeah.
and get medication that's not pharmaceutical grade because of stuff like supply chain. And I'm constantly screaming about supply chain because I sometimes have to wait 3 weeks for a medication that I that
Mm,
sounds silly, but my life depends on that medication. So for 3 weeks of no
yeah.
medication, after about 10, I can manage about 10 days, but after about 10 days, I am bedbound. So I completely understand the
Mm,
need for regulating the supply chain, and pharmacies. Come on, man. Like, why are we losing
mm,
people? Why am I waiting
mm,
3 weeks? Come on. That's just my little comment
yeah.
there.
Yeah.
But yeah, we definitely
Yeah,
do.
yeah, and I think it's important as well to bear in mind that not only that it's the long wait, and then also what that does to people psychologically, but also they're spending over £350 to be waiting so
Yeah,
long to get the
yeah,
product. Where unfortunately, you could go down the road to John, Peter, or Paul and spend £20 and get it sorted. So it is something that does need to be
yeah. No,
addressed.
no, definitely, definitely. And I know a lot of the pharmacies, they work really, really hard. I mean, I know there's a lot of issues with the home office, and actually, the list goes on as to why there is a
Mm,
supply chain issue. It extends much further than the pharmacies, but it's still something that really
yeah.
needs to be rectified, because, like I said earlier, some patients, unfortunately, lives do depend on it. Like, I mean, someone with epilepsy,
Mm,
like, I'm fortunate enough that I can
yeah.
go without it. I'll just be bedbound. But someone with epilepsy could actually have a seizure and die. Like, their life depends on this
Yeah.
medication. So
Yeah.
that is very heartbreaking to
Yeah.
hear that people are, yeah. But I'm not gonna go on forever, because once I start, I never stop. Everyone knows me at this point. But for anybody that is interested in getting some more information on what Ezra does with Edifying Answers, the links will be in the description below. And Ezra, thank you so much again for joining us. And I look forward to seeing
You're
everyone
welcome.
next week, where we will explore medical cannabis as a medication.